Good day, everyone, and welcome to Eden Seminary's Schmiechen Lectures, this year featuring colleagues in theology and ministry in collaboration with global ministries, reflecting on partnership in the face of the COVID-19 global pandemic. I'm Deb Krause, President of the Seminary, and I am honored to welcome you all from different parts of the world, the United States, and the St. Louis region to this forum. The Schmiechen Lectures were endowed several years ago by the Schmiechen family to honor Samuel John Schmiechen, whose ministry embodied a deep love for theological study and the practice of ministry. That combination of rigorous reflection on the traditions and resources of the church and the practice of ministry is a hallmark of Eden's curriculum and programs. Today's lectures embody this purpose and bear witness to the breadth of Eden's mission and relationship across the globe. We are grateful to God that in the midst of this pandemic, we are blessed with resources to gather in this virtual forum and with the resources of one another's expertise, tradition, culture, and experience. This day promises to be an important opportunity to listen, learn, and build our networks of collaboration and cooperation to be faithful agents of God's redemptive love, justice, and mercy in these critical times. To introduce our esteemed lecturers and the program, I would like to now thank and welcome the Reverend Dr. Mary Schaller-Blaufus, Eden's Vice President for Institutional Advancement and Communications, who brings her considerable experience and network in global ministerial partnerships to Eden's mission, and who has collaborated with the Non-Degree Programs Committee of the faculty and staff to organize this important forum. Thank you and welcome, Mary.
Thank you, President Krause. It is so great to be here with these presenters and with all of you who are participating in this lecture presentation panel. I am thrilled that Eden Seminary can be part of the Global Ministries Southern Asia Initiative, and that the Global Ministries and partners can be part of Eden Seminary's programming and leadership development. This kind of partnership extends our reach and makes our possibilities for being change agents in the world even more robust. I would like to present our coordinating presenter today, the Reverend Dr. Dinabandhu Manchella, who is the Southern Asia Executive for Global Ministries. And the presenters for this first session of these Schmiechen Lectures will be introduced by him. If you join us again at 11 o'clock Central Time, we will have another panel of presenters, two of whom happen to be Eden alumni. And so we are thrilled for that possibility. During the presentations, if you would put your questions or observations in the chat for everyone, I will be collecting those throughout the presentations, and at the end of this session and at the end of the second session, we will have a short period for question and answer with our panelists. So with that, Dinabandhu, turn it over to you.
Hello. Good morning. I would like to introduce briefly the Global Ministries. Global Ministries is a common witness of the United Church of Christ and the Disciples of Christ Christian Church. And it works with about 300 partners around the world in about 90 countries. And I would like to briefly introduce to you about the Southern Asia Initiative at this moment. Southern Asia Initiative Southern Asia Initiative is started in 2019, and it will go on till 2021. Southern Asia Initiative is an occasion for learning and interaction to be enriched by different expressions of Christian witness in multi-religious contexts. And it would focus on people's initiatives, missional and diaconal actions, and creative theological resources. It explores concrete possibilities to be more creative and engaged in context of struggle for justice, peace, and human dignity. And it is an opportunity for the members of the United Church of Christ and the Christian Church, Disciples of Christ, to be enriched by different expressions of Christian faith in certain distinct and diverse contexts of Southern Asia, and to forge partnerships with people who are engaged in people's issues and struggles. Global Ministries Southern Asia region works with partners and institutions and projects in Afghanistan, Bangladesh, India, Nepal, Sri Lanka, Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, Thailand, and Indonesia, and Timor-Leste. And for Global Ministries, for the Southern Asia Initiative, the theme that guides our work is Together in Hope. And we hope that this particular theme, Together in Hope, brings the churches in both the contexts together into partnerships for life and justice. To guide our work, the Southern Asia Initiative is guided by 4 themes, which are affirmation of human dignity, especially in response to human trafficking, slavery, and forced migration, and to uphold freedom of religion as a human right, particularly in response to the aggressive assertions of majoritarian religio-political ideologies, and churches to be and to effect just and open and inclusive communities, and particularly in response to resurgence of cultures of discrimination and exclusion, and to safeguard the integrity of creation. And this is in response to the industrial and consumer cultures that destroy and commodify the earth, people, and its relationships. And part of our work, we have been focusing our advocacy efforts on religious freedom, climate change, rights of migrant workers, Dalit human rights, and anti-human trafficking efforts. And some of the major features of the Southern Asia initiatives are visits to the region and Bible studies, theological reflections, VBS material, liturgical resources, and media inputs. And most of these are already available on our web pages. And encounters with Dalit theology, tribal theology, Asian theologies, and interfaith initiatives, podcasts, news feeds, and other relevant topics. And we hope that you would participate in the Southern Asia Initiative and gain from this experience.
The Global Ministries Southern Asia Initiative invites you to walk together in hope with partners in the Southern Asia region as we discover what it means to live faithfully. Despite a complex history of cultures, spiritual tradition, growing economies, and emerging technology, Asia has also been home to the largest number of the poor in the world. This has made the region susceptible to dictatorships, terrorism, fundamentalism, bigotry, human rights violations, and caste-based violence. But the marginalized have been resilient despite their circumstances. Asia is diverse in faith, but Christian churches find themselves at the crossroads of being rooted and relevant, while also remaining connected with their faith traditions. Amidst human suffering, need, and injustice, churches in the region aim to stand together in faith and hope. We in Global Ministries stand with them as we receive and share good news together. During this 18-month initiative, we will explore topics such as caring for creation and agriculture, affirming human dignity, upholding freedom of religion as a human right, urging churches to be open, just, and inclusive communities. We will engage in these topics through advocacy opportunities, people-to-people pilgrimage trips, Bible studies, worship materials, special giving opportunities, videos, and educational resources. The Southern Asia Initiative is an opportunity for learning about the spirit of partnership and connecting with the people and partners in Southern Asia. Join with Global Ministries and partners in Southern Asia as we walk together in hope.
For this lecture, Schmiechen lecture, I would like to introduce to you the speakers. To begin with, Mr. Paul Divakar. We are very fortunate to have one of the outstanding human rights activists from India, who has given consistent leadership to internationalize the Dalit struggle for dignity and justice for the past 2 decades. Because of his pioneering efforts, International Dalit Solidarity Network, Asia Dalit Rights Forum, and National Campaign for Dalit Human Rights have come into being. Many people around the world know about the Dalit struggles for justice and dignity because of Paul Divakar. Mr. Divakar from New Delhi, India, is the leading advocate for Dalit rights, an expert on economic rights, and a human rights defender. He is the convener of the Global Forum on Discrimination Based on Work and Dissent. He also serves as the chairperson of the Asia Dalit Rights Forum. He is also the founding member of the National Campaign on Dalit Human Rights. He has been actively engaged in issues around the intersectionality of gender, caste, financial accountability, transparency, and participation. A longtime partner in struggle and a personal friend, I'm grateful for his contribution. And his presentation will be followed by Dr. Mary Kuliman, who will speak on the theme Together in Hope through solidarity with migrants and victims of human trafficking. Dr. Mary Kuliman is a leading Asian ecumenical and women theologian passionate about migrant workers and human trafficking. Dr. Kuliman serves as the moderator of the Protestant Evangelical Church of Timor in Indonesia. Dr. Kuliman, who earned her doctorate in missiology from the Protestant Theological University of the Netherlands, also teaches courses in missiology and in contextual theology at the graduate program of Arthawacana Christian University in Kupang, Indonesia. She served for 2 terms as an international member of Global Ministries, and in March 2018, she was awarded the International Sylvia Michel Prize for the promotion of leadership functions of women in the church by the Reformed Church of Switzerland. I welcome both our speakers and thank you that you are with us this morning.
Greetings from the Global Forum on Discrimination Based on Work and Descent. My name is Paul Divakar. I'm the convener of this Global Forum, and I'm very happy to be with you today. I particularly would like to thank UCC and the Global Ministries, especially the Eden Theological Seminary, for this wonderful webinar that you have organized and for the space that you have given me today. Let me dive directly into the subject. The story of burning alive of Namala Balaswamy, which was brought to the heads of the state at the UN World Conference Against Racism in 2001, did not have any mention or about that incident or about the people in the declaration and program of action that has come out after the conference. Similarly, when Noor Iftin, MP from Somalia, raised the issue of discrimination and violence against some of the people of Shambara, the parliament in Somalia has not actively responded. Just another story of burning alive because of intercaste marriage in the village. These are not stray incidents. Similarly, when you go to another part of the world, in Europe, Roma community face a similar kind of discrimination, stigmatization, and criminalization of those communities right across from Ireland to Russia, across several of the European countries, where even though the human rights framework exists, the experiences of the people are similar to those what we have seen in India and in Africa and in other parts of the world.
I'm from Mauritania, and in Mauritania we have a big issue. It's slavery. Not only contemporary forms of slavery, but traditional slavery. And is a big problem because victims of this problem are about 50% of the total of population of Mauritania. So Mauritania, the power is with the minority of Arabs, Berbers, and the same people who have the power are slave owners too.
In Somalia, there is a discrimination, undeniable discrimination that exists for quite some time. However, the situation, it is not alleviating, but it is deteriorating day after day. Imagine people, especially the marginalized group of Somali people, in one way they have a challenge from Al-Shabaab, the other way they have a challenge from the dominant clan. So they are very much suffering, and world have less aware about that.
So Roma are the biggest minority in Europe, but also in the whole world. In Europe, we are about 12 million. In the whole world, we are about 20 million people, which makes quite a large share of the population. But it happens that Roma actually are the group which face the risk of the poverty. Only in Europe, it's 80% of the Roma population are actually facing the risk to fall in very deep poverty. Roma are being segregated in schools. They are receiving special education, which is much lower quality education, so they cannot enjoy the mainstream high quality education very often just because of the Romani origin. It's very hard to access jobs. There's a huge discrimination in employment. Sometimes it's because of having this low quality education, but very often it's because of the skin color or the surname or just an address that Roma are living in. Roma are also very much being discriminated by the institutions themselves. There's a hard way to access the services, very often also the documents, the ID documents, the birth certificates in some of the countries in Europe. Roma are facing a big deal of evictions. I think actually the school segregation and evictions, like the forcibly non-voluntary evictions, it's one of the biggest problems Roma are facing in Europe. And it's of course affecting also their way of if you don't have a place to stay, you cannot send children to school, you can hardly find a job. So it's kind of perpetuating the situation, and it is making very hard for Roma to get out of this vicious circle.
Nearly about 260 million people are fighting for their justice and equality. This discrimination issues not yet addressed in United Nations because no states or no countries are ready to bring these issues to the notice of UN.
What these groups contend with is called discrimination based on work and descent. There are two parts, work and descent. Work here represents the coerced, occupational and locally stigmatized forms of labor. Work has been also labeled as polluted, as opposed to the pure forms of labor, which is mostly done by white collar, religious, or mostly by the dominant caste. They would include, for example, sanitation, death work, grave digging, leather work, devalued musical and traditional performances, which are, most of them are slave-like occupations, free labor, which need to be given free of cost to the dominant caste. Descent here refers to the inescapable birth-based criteria which exists in the social systems of many of these countries. To enforce this descent, the population is restricted to marry within the caste, which is enforced endogamy. And this is policed by violence. If anybody dares to cross the line and marries so-called intercaste, as what we had seen in Somalia, what he had seen in many parts of India and other places, they will be burnt alive and so-called honor killing. So there is a very clear restriction. So work and descent. So this word, discrimination based on work and descent, has been coined recently by the UN and has also been used by several UN human rights bodies in identifying this particular type of discrimination, which is different from racism as well as from indigeneity and other forms of discrimination that we see. This type of discrimination is typically associated with the notions of purity and pollution and practices of untouchability, and it is deeply rooted in societies and cultures where this discrimination is practiced, to the extent now that even if you change religions, even if there is a conversion, it is not only restricted to one religion, Hinduism. It is there present in Christianity, it is there present in Islam, there present in Buddhism and Sikhism and several other religions. It has permeated. Discrimination based on work and descent affects over 260 million people in the world. If all of them gather in one place, we would be the 7th largest nation in the world. It spreads over Asia, Africa, Europe, South America, North Americas. I don't think there is a place where it doesn't exist. It has not been uncovered. And this estimate of 260 is a very, very conservative estimate, because in many countries, these communities, there is no data available of these communities or the practices that are existing very virulently in these countries. In Asia, the DWT communities coincide with what we are very familiar as Dalit communities, erstwhile the untouchable communities, the scheduled castes. It's the largest contingent, about 220 million people in India, Nepal, Bangladesh, and Pakistan. In Sri Lanka, the other communities in Asia are Al Muhammashin in Yemen and Burakumin in Japan. In Canada, especially in the US, United States, we see many types of discrimination based on work and descent exist, but they are overshadowed by the overwhelming xenophobia and white racism that cuts across several non-white populations. There are broadly 10 types of barriers they face as human rights violations arising out of the systems of caste and discrimination based on work and descent. They are barriers to free movement, barriers to access civic amenities, hate crimes including hate speech, access to political representation, discriminations in school, education, social, economic and political, discrimination in the market, land markets, rural markets, discrimination in disaster response. There is clear discrimination in disaster response, especially in the pre-disaster, during disaster and post-disaster. Forced unclean occupations and manual scavenging, extreme forms of violence and torture, and discrimination in allocation in public expenditure of budgets. It is our belief that all human beings are equal, as the Charter of UN Declaration of Human Rights affirm, in the dignity and worth of the human person and in the equal rights of men and women, and have determined to promote social progress, and that everyone is entitled to all the rights and freedoms without distinction of any kind, such as race, color, sex, language, religion, political or other opinion, national or social origin, property, birth or other status. This includes caste. However, this is wrought with challenges. Racism, as we know, is mostly abolished in many countries, in most countries. But the privileges, the exclusions, the discrimination and the violence, it's still rampant in many societies. The violence that we have seen in the death of George Floyd is another mockery that is still looking at us and making the entire declaration and the constitutional provisions completely dismantled, because it is not only present, but sometimes it seems to be institutionalized in the systems of access to justice, and not only in the system of access to justice, but in several other parts of the governance system. Similarly, when you look at DWD and the caste in several countries, India, Nepal and Mauritania have recognized this. Japan is another country which has recognized this. But several other countries, and we have counted at least 21 to 23, which evidence still says it exists, it is not even recognized as a form of a crime that needs to be abolished. There are no systems to identify. And even in these countries that we are talking, only I think in India, you have some forms of legislative mechanisms, institutional provisions, budgetary allocations, which try to ensure that these barriers are crossed, but the implementation is still a problem. But rest of the world, there is nothing that exists which looks at this issue and sees how is it that we need to address. So when that is the case in both against racism and in the issues of caste and DWD, we see the UN is also very silent on many of these aspects. There seems to be a glass ceiling where every other forms of discrimination is being discussed, but the DWD seems to be a bar.
So I believe that the secret lies also in forging our strength in terms of grassroots communities and the UN putting pressure on governments at the same time. I always say that this is like a pump, you know, one comes from bottom up, the communities have to come from bottom up, the UN has to come from top down. And then if you put the government in the middle, you're going to exercise that pressure that they need to have in order to realize that they have an issue.
Now, we don't see UN willing to discuss this particular aspect at all. And this, I think, needs to be challenged as to why this particular aspect of DWD, when you have recognized racism, when you have recognized indigeneity, when you have recognized gender and other related issues of torture, why is it that particularly these issues affecting 260 million people across the world are not addressed at the UN? I think this is a major challenge for many of the communities, and I think this is where a kind of a joint action between those who are against racism and those who are against discrimination based on work and descent need to continually join our actions for a strategy to strengthen our hope to see that this indeed will be something that we shall overcome. So one of the first steps that is needed is for the UN to have a declaration against discrimination based on work and descent. A declaration is the first step which recognizes this practice and which commits all the member states and also UN as a whole to protect and promote specifically the DWD communities and ensure that they access these rights. But it's not enough that it has a declaration. We also need a convention for elimination of the practice of discrimination based on work and descent in all its forms. Similar to the one that we have, UN Convention for Elimination of Racial Discrimination. We need such mechanisms. What is the way we need to bring this together? It is not enough that only as Dalits, only as dismembered communities across the entire world, we cannot continue to do this in fractured voice. We need to come and get our act together. It is indeed responsibility of the governments in countries where racism, casteism, and discrimination based on work exist. The constitutions, the legal provisions need to be made. The executive machinery needs to be appraised of. It have all the directions. And of course, the duty bearer needs to be informed and properly oriented. However, the faith bodies have an equal responsibility to make sure that these systems also need to be understood as they generate their own narratives. What is the narrative that the church has for those who are affected by racism? What is the narrative that the Indian churches have for those who are affected by casteism on both sides of the line? The perpetrators as well as for those who have been under the clutches of casteism and has been excluded. They are there in the congregations, but our congregations are still segregated, and there is one theology of the perpetrators and there is a theology of the oppressed. Is there one way in which we can bring the real liberative elements and put it not just in the rhetorics at the theological seminaries, but can we make sure that these are translated into powerful messages to the women's fellowship, to the youth fellowship, as modules in the Sunday schools? Will they be able to make sure that in their routine life they can pick up streams of exclusion, they can pick up streams of racism and make sure they become themselves a liberative elements being transformed by the teachings of the church? Friends, I think this is an important role in this point in history where we are called upon not just being good citizens, but also ensure the real liberative spirit comes from us and from our teachings. And to this end, I'm sure that we will take this liberative message not only in areas which are already been been made visible, especially also in these areas of discrimination based on work and descent, where it's still hidden, bring out the real good news to the poor. And together, in hope against racism and casteism, Jai Bhim.
Sisters and brothers in Jesus Christ, I am Mary Colimon from the Evangelical Protestant Church in Timor, Gemit. I would like to greet all of you. Thank you for this opportunity to share about Gemit's ministry in solidarity with victims of human trafficking. Eden Seminary is not foreign to us in Timor because a member of one of our congregation, Elina Otu, studied at Eden, so your name is quite familiar to us. One of the core ministries of the church is to build hope in fellowship. That is what the Evangelical Protestant Church in Timor is doing in relation to its ministry of solidarity with victims and survivors of human trafficking. Given that our province, East Nusa Tenggara, is one of the provinces in Indonesia with the highest number of human trafficking victims, the church cannot avoid this humanitarian ministry. Because they have no hope for the future in their villages, young people flee from their villages. They migrate to other more developed islands in Indonesia, or even they go abroad. Unfortunately, they are not equipped with adequate education and skills, and as a result, they are vulnerable to becoming victims of human trafficking. Therefore, our church ministry service is to build and nurture the hope that God has given to human for a just life. Since 2016, our church has felt it is important to develop its capacity to provide an adequate response to the issue of human trafficking. One of our ministerial division at the synod level is dedicated to respond to natural and humanitarian disasters, including this issue of human trafficking. Through various preparation and in collaboration with a number of partners, finally, in February 2018, Gemit's House of Hope was established and started serving victims of trafficking and of gender-based violence. House of Hope is a means for our church to prevent human trafficking and to assist victims and survivors. House of Hope provides several services. For example, provision of a shelter for victims' recovery, legal services, reintegration with families, economic empowerment, and education to congregation and local communities. As the name suggests, the House of Hope, Gemit emphasizes that hope exists in faith of God's grace. Through this very force of service, Gemit proclaims that hope exists when solidarity is built. From several reports of House of Hope, we learn that the practical forms of violence related to human trafficking include physical violence, economic violence, and violence that result from one's vulnerable legal status. For this reason, House of Hope services seek to address the needs of victims of these forms of violence with the intention of preventing trafficking, as well as dealing with and rehabilitating victims and their condition. In the following, I want to describe some services related to what House of Hope is doing about human trafficking. The first thing I want to tell you about the shelter. The shelter of House of Hope was established with the intention of protecting and restoring victims of physical and psychological violence. In general, the migrant workers who have been served at the shelter return to the province with a physical illness or are in a state of psychological shock. At the shelter, they receive support to regain their physical health and to recover from psychological trauma. The shelter are also function as a safe house for victims who experience security threats, either from agents who recruited them or from their own families. That's why the address of the shelter has not been made public to help guarantee the security of those who stay there. While at the shelter, victims and survivors receive lodging, food and drink, coverage of medical expenses, and various other basic needs. It must be admitted that until the House of Hope, not a single institution in our town, the provincial capital, provided shelter services specifically for victims of human trafficking. Therefore, the presence of Gemit's House of Hope was very needed and welcomed by various parties. Today, Department of Social Services, the police, and other local NGOs often cooperate with the House of Hope with referrals of victims and survivors of human trafficking. In this way, the church is present in building hope together with the most vulnerable groups in society. The second aspect of House of Hope ministry is legal services. The House of Hope provision of legal services is important for serving victims and survivors who experience legal problems, such as withholding of their wages by agents or employers, falsification of documents, and undocumented processes of migration. In addition to accompanying victims and survivors when they report their problems to the police, House of Hope volunteers also accompany them at court proceedings. One of the challenges we experience is that judicial process for human trafficking only indicts individuals who implement various phases of trafficking, but not the intellectual actors who benefit the most. Nevertheless, there has been some progress because at least some criminal sanctions through the judicial process have begun to be issued. We have learned that the presence of pastors in court to accompany victims and their families has an impact. Often the victims of members of their families has little formal education and come from the lower classes in society. Often they are not adept at addressing their legal problems. Therefore, they need legal experts to help them. Not only that, it is not uncommon for the judicial process to be unfair to them. When pastors wearing their clerical collars are present in court proceedings, judges and prosecutors become reluctant to belittle the victims whose cases are being tried. As one of the major religious institutions in the province, Gemit has a strong negotiation position. This context is very helpful for the House of Hope, especially in its networking and advocacy strategy. The third area of ministry of House of Hope is education for congregation or for local communities. In collaboration with several parties, we create communication, information, and education modules. We create simple and popular forms of education, including through talks, sermon materials, pamphlets, and documentary films. For this education, we work through the congregational, presbytery, and synod church structure. In this way, the House of Hope raises awareness about human trafficking and at the same time strengthens the capacity of church leaders to respond. We see that this is a good strategy for bringing the issue of human trafficking to the church. If previously there was the view that social affairs are not the responsibility of the church, this approach encourages church members and ministers to begin embracing this humanitarian work as part of the church ministry. Currently, an increasing number of Gemit congregations are aware of the problem of human trafficking. Changes in the church perspective on this issue has begun to spread, as seen in sermons that raise the issue of the issue as an important issue or important topic. Some congregations are also starting to be involved in the reintegration of trafficking victims into their communities. We have learned that good education can change perspective, especially when we have good materials and approach. The four things I want to mention is about economic empowerment. One reason people leave their villages to become migrant workers, either in other Indonesian islands or to go abroad, is because of economic poverty. Therefore, efforts to prevent and address the problem of migration and human trafficking in our context cannot ignore the need for economic empowerment. In our office, the Gemit Synod's Division on Asset Empowerment and Economic Strength is tasked with economic empowerment, including the economy of returning migrant workers. We work with some partners to train and provide venture capital for farmer migrant workers and their families. The training includes development of horticultural or agricultural, weaving, and some other skills. We still need to evaluate the extent to which these economic empowerment services actually have an impact. And because of the social restriction caused by COVID-19 pandemic, we have difficulty interacting closely with migrant workers at this time. Along with the economic empowerment of returning migrant workers, there is also a need for continual advocacy of the government to strengthen the economic base of the province rather than relying so much on the revenue contributed by migrant workers. The pattern of exporting cheap labor rather than building up the local economic base of communities in our province needs to be reversed. To date, this has not yet been a priority for the House of Hope's ministry due to staff and budget limitation. And for the last thing, I want to tell you about cargo ministry. One of the important ministry of House of Hope is cargo ministry at the cargo terminal of the main airport of our province. This ministry is important because it provides a much needed pastoral presence for families whose parents, siblings, or children have died far away. This ministry is also interesting because when the bodies of migrant workers are sent from Malaysia or from other countries, volunteers that include Protestant pastors, along with Catholic nuns and priests, gather to receive coffins, greet family members, and perform short service before the bodies are then taken to their villages. This joint ministry nurtures a valuable ecumenical relationship worth recognizing and celebrating. This volunteer team even has a car to help deliver bodies to their villages if needed. If more than one body arrive at the cargo terminal and transportation provided by the government is limited, the volunteer team's car can be used. For family members of migrant workers who have died away from home, this ministry is a sign of solidarity. Although the experience of receiving a coffin is very painful for the volunteers, at the same time, they are grateful that these poor families are not alone in their grief. Churches and other civil society communities stand together with them. I want to share with you some of my reflection from the story I just told you. Lesson that we learn from this ministry. I want to mention 2 points of my reflection. One is about keeping hope alive. Hope is the power in the human spirit to see the light of the future optimistically. Hope is connected to positive feelings about one's own life, one's environment, and the future. Hope gives human strength to overcome limitation of the time, even to overcome the chaos of life. Hope gives humans the ability to endure, even to struggle against the hardship of life, and to rebuild their lives after great suffering and loss. Very often, because of life's burdens are so heavy, humans are unable to see the light before them and become discouraged. Losing hope can make people lose their vitality because they don't believe the future can be better. People who lose hope can hurt themselves and hurt others too. Hope is the main values in Christian life, besides faith and love. That's what we can read in 1 Corinthians 13:13. Christian faith emphasizes that by God's grace, humans have hope. The Apostle Paul wrote that God is working for the good of humans. These texts are often a source of comfort for Christians who are close to despair. Hope for God's providence gives strength to believe that things can improve. Hope in God's providence gives strength to strive for oneself and for others. The church has a duty to invigorate and to live out faith, hope, and love. Faith in God's love and action to create, save, and renew God's creation. Love for others and for God. And the hope that by God's grace we can struggle for a better future. The basis of our hope is faith that God loves the world, including humans. The second reflection I want to share with you is about hope built in solidarity. Hoping in God means opening up oneself to be absorbed by God's divine power, which gives humans the strength not to be apathetic, but instead to be positive about life. Hope in God's providence also empowers humans to share power with others in the struggle for life. This Christian's hope gives people a reason to be in solidarity with one another, to encourage one another, to endure difficulties, and to strive for a better life together. Hope is found in fellowship. Lonely humans are very vulnerable to losing hope. People who end their lives are often lonely people. Solidarity among
ஹலோ சொல்லுங்க.
Hello, friends. With apologies for technical difficulties, Dr. Coleman's presentation was almost finished. And so rich conversation about solidarity and the House of Hope. And we are grateful for your contributions and for the theological imagination that you are sparking in us. We are going to move to our next presenter, who is Dr. Dinabandhu Manchela.
Thanks to Mr. Paul Divakar and Dr. Mary Coleman for their very insightful and challenging presentations and for their partnership. I would like to share with you some challenges posed by the pandemic and elaborate how these necessitate organizing, recognizing partnership as a new theological principle in the given moment in time. In just over 8 months, a dangerous microbial has turned and continues to turn the world upside down, killing over 1 million people and infecting over 35 million in 213 countries. COVID-19 is devastating lives and families, tumbling down economies, and wreaking havoc on all fronts in the lives of all alike, the wealthy and the impoverished, the powerful and the disempowered, and the privileged and the deprived. With vaccines several months or years away, it looks like the journey is going to be long and hard, with many more unsettling realities along the way. No one seems to know when all this would end. But when it does, after all the losses and the new patterns of life in between, the post-COVID world is going to be different from the one slipping away. But when the pandemic struck us, many of us, optimists like me, thought that the pandemic would help us human beings to go through a process of introspection, recognize our shared vulnerability, and reclaim a sense of mutuality and abandon our obsessive pursuits for domination and destruction, and make changes to the way we govern our political and economic life and social dynamics. But nothing of that has happened. And if at all it did, it has only been on the fringes. On the other hand, we have only seen and heard these detrimental trends continue and in fact escalating even further. Mr. Divakar has helped us to understand how cultures of discrimination and exclusion in different parts of the world continue to rob people of their rights to live with dignity and justice. He has also challenged us to recognize the moral imperative of dismantling these evil cultures as an expression of our faithfulness to the God of life and justice. Dr. Mary Coleman has told us how certain socially and economically disempowered and thus made vulnerable people, mostly women and children, have become commodities of pleasure and profit. She has also shared with us how her own church has done to make a difference by rescuing and rehabilitating the victims and survivors, and in educating the community about the ills of human trafficking. In fact, there are many such threats and challenges. I would like to add just 3 more in order for us to understand the decisiveness of this moment for theological vocation. First is the continuing obsession with economic growth at the expense of life and people. The pandemic has continued to be a time for these aggressive assertions of power and privilege amidst sharp systemic inequalities and human deprivation as never before. The poor, the working classes, the migrant laborers in my country were treated as liabilities, even though they are the engines of the economy. It has also exposed how healthcare is inaccessible for many, and how the so-called market economy lacks the capacities to protect people in the face of the pandemic. Furthermore, this global worship of mammon in the name of neoliberal economy has also made certain life-denying practices seem normal and acceptable. Injustices, inequalities are institutionalized. The looming economic recession is likely to further accelerate and normalize abuse and exploitation of human beings and the Earth's resources. The second is the increasingly dysfunctional democracies. Authoritarian regimes, right-wing ideologies, majoritarian politics, post-truth populism, and are making democracies dysfunctional and anti-poor in many parts of the world. The values of justice, equity, and common good are replaced by greed, domination, and cruelty. The pandemic has not stopped, in fact, increased the torture and incarceration of human rights activists and political opponents, repressive measures to silence dissent and people's movements, and to control labor laws that would give unbridled freedom to business houses to exploit the vulnerable people. The third is a shocking reality of religion as a dangerous force in the world. The so-called sacred has turned lethal as never before. Religious resources, religious identities, religious institutions, and communities are increasingly becoming sources of hatred and division, rejection and exclusion, aggression and arrogance. The pandemic has turned out to be an opportunity to accelerate the processes of exclusion and victimization of religious and ethnic minorities in many parts of the world. White evangelicalism, Zionism, Islamic radicalism, militant Buddhism, and Hindutva, a supremacist ideology in my country, India, and others have become allies of dominant versions of nationalism and patriotism. So as the world treads into an uncertain future, most such harsh realities may become frequent. But there have also been some distinct signs of hope. One is the spontaneous expressions of compassion and human solidarity amidst the pandemic in many parts of the world. With many collectives, some big and mostly small, across barriers reaching out to the people in need. Two is the increasing occurrence of people's resistance, both big and small in many parts of the world, responding to the challenges of systemic injustice and violation of lives and rights. Black Lives Matters movement, Dalit Lives Matters movement, Thursdays in Black, environmental movements, human rights movements, BDS movement in solidarity with the Palestinians, and many other movements against political repression and injustice, and the interfaith initiatives for justice are but a few to mention. As someone said, there seems to be a contagion of resistance against injustice and abuse worldwide. These actions also assert their conviction that what is considered normal should not be the new normal. And these are indeed the signs of hope to imagine a new world of justice, dignity, and life for all. So this also reveals that the world is indeed at crossroads, a decisive moment at that. And we see a moral divide with those who, no matter what the pandemic has done and can do, continue their pursuits of power and wealth on one hand, and there are others, the resistance movements, alternative voices that insist and aspire that the old order must go if the earth and its people must have a future on the other hand. In a world dominated by a network of dominant powers, we see these small, spontaneous expressions of partnerships of people in solidarity, in resistance, and hope. These issues of life and people bring together and sustain partnerships. People's movements, civil society organizations, service organizations, activists, academics, and students come together into these partnerships, even as these are not necessarily inspired or accompanied by faith resources or social ideologies. These may not be perfect or organized enough to sustain, but these are growing, and these are the only alternative that we have in the world at the given moment in time. Therefore, as we find ourselves at this crossroads, it seems an opportune moment for churches and theological communities, in fact, for all faith communities to discern their role in shaping the emerging world. What then would be the distinct contribution of faith communities to these partnerships? This prompts us to recognize the decisiveness of partnerships, not only as a strategy, but also actually as the end result. It is a core principle for a vision of the world that can assure life for all people. Actually, partnership is formative to Christian self-understanding as it defines one's sense of being in relation with people and of all God's creation. Partnership is a conscious spiritual choice, an attitude that celebrates and asserts God's intention for the sanctity and integrity of life, both at personal and social levels. The biblical story is about God's partnership with creation, about God's constant intrusion into human affairs to hold us accountable for our failings, as well as to encourage us to be partners to sustain and celebrate life. God's incarnation in Christ is also God's concrete expression of God's partnership with the world. Jesus' life, message, and ministry testifies to the struggle against life-denying and destructive partnerships between the religious and political powers of his time. In contrast, he partnered with the marginalized and the outcasts. In that, Jesus announces the distinctness of God's justice as it restores both the victim and the aggressor. When there is justice, there is peace and life for all. God's justice is the basis for God's covenant with humanity and all forms of life. It is inclusive and transformative. It seeks transformation of relationships at all levels, interpersonal and structural. Therefore, justice is pivotal for life. As such, justice is not an option for Christians, but a necessary expression of authentic Christian witness. Therefore, either we partner with those who are unjustly treated or with the forces of injustice. Therefore, creating, nurturing, and participating in partnerships for life is a moral and spiritual necessity. Partnership for justice, therefore, is not only a means towards an end, but the end result, the eschatological fulfillment of God's plan of salvation through reconciliation. What does this mean to church? The church in all its diverse expressions and identities has been on hold during the current lockdowns. The physical church is likely to remain virtual for long. Many are now able to have this experience from the comforts of their homes. But there were also some others who were convinced that there could still be a church, despite lockdowns and curfews, through their presence and actions in solidarity with those in need. In fact, there have always been some who saw themselves as church through their vocations of public engagement, even if they did not align themselves with any visible ecclesial community. The point is, whatever identities and expressions the empirical church takes, what ultimately matters for its credibility is how honestly it responds to the imperatives of the faith that calls it into being. The church is real in places and in moments when it witnesses to the reign of God through its presence and action. The moment in time seems to suggest an ecclesial reimagination. Church's primary calling is to be a transformed and transforming community. It is an alternative that has the mandate to propose alternatives to the fallen structures of human relationships. The church cannot be a power structure with hierarchical institutional protocols that only echo the moral aberrations of our time. It must be intentionally open and inclusive at all levels of its life. We perhaps need to see church as people than as institutions. Church needs to find its self-identity as an event of the manifestation of God's grace, its self-understanding as an organic expression of God's plan of grand reconciliation of the whole creation, and its form as a movement than as an institution. It also necessitates the need to reimagine church as a community called to be partners with God rather than a mere community of believers. Its life, witness, find expression in partnerships. These partnerships are not exclusive, but are open and inclusive of all those who strive for the reign of God. In this sense, partnership does not characterize church's life and action, then it would merely be a religious community like any other. This moment also seems to prompt a new understanding of mission. Mission has always been grasped through its implied meaning of being sent or commissioned to accomplish a task. Churches in different contexts of time and space understood and responded to this sentness as per the influences of the time and space. Be that as it may, by and large, these assertions and expressions of mission have always been centered around human agency and the related spheres of life. However, we are now faced with a pandemic, an invisible virus that comes from outside the human domain. The challenge now is to reimagine mission and the commission to be engaged in mission in a situation where all the aggressors and the aggressed, the powerful and the disempowered, are on its grip, are all in its grip with fear, distress, and uncertainties as their common experience. However, both the pandemic and its consequences do not spare human complicity. The pandemic comes as a result of prolonged and willful destruction of our ecosystem. Along with it, the complicity of the combination of political and economic ideologies and certain anthropocentric religious doctrines must also be acknowledged. These have constantly created, sustained, and legitimized breaches in human consciousness of life, and in damaging their capacities to view life in its interconnectedness. The point here is that we are in need of healing and restoration of ourselves as human beings and human communities. And that is possible only through a new consciousness of the interconnectedness of life. Therefore, in contrast to the sent dimension of mission by powers and regimes, the vulnerable earth and its vulnerable people seem to indicate sentness as a pilgrimage towards collective transformation. Mission then is not a religious project, but a vocation of nurturing a new consciousness of life and of restoring and sustaining interdependent dynamics of life. But what does all this mean to theology? How do theological vocation and theological education equip the church to be part of these alternative voices and network of life and hope? The pandemic has once again exposed our attitudes of utter disregard for the sanctity of life and the complete ignorance of the interconnectedness of life. This truncated view of life continues to sustain much of our faith affirmation about life, God, and the world. The individualistic, anthropocentric understanding of salvation, pursuits of peace and prosperity, certain church-centered piety, options for convenient forms of service, and proselytizing projects in the name of evangelization are a few obvious examples. In order to recover from this distorted view of life, we must perhaps re-anchor our understanding of and our relationship with God in the affirmation of God as the creator of life. Vast, diverse, and beautiful, the creation in all its intricate interconnectedness and interdependence is God's self-expression and of God's wisdom and generosity. Any breach, therefore, is a breach that affects all, the whole creation itself, hence contrary to the will of God. The task for theology today is to help faith seek that reconnection, to reconnect with one another and the earth. The good news of God's reign is truly good, not only when it is good only for a few or only for the human beings, but for the whole creation. This also points to the need of assessment of our belief systems to reclaim a holistic view of life that enables more responsible expressions of faith. The moment in time points towards the need to be informed by the theologies of life, those that arise from the struggles of people for justice, dignity, and against oppression and domination. Theologies that took shape in predominantly Western, Christian, politically and economically powerful contexts are not helpful anymore, not only for those of us in multi-religious contexts, but also for the world that we live in, one that stares at us to take a stand on justice and truth. Therefore, let me end by asserting that the churches have made positive differences in history when they saw themselves as movements and when they were with people, which enabled them to read the signs of the times and to understand their purpose, of their being in those contexts that made them creative and life-affirming forces. We as churches, mission agencies, ecumenical organizations, and theological communities need to be constantly on the move, discerning change, open to change, effecting change in order that we may not only stay relevant, but also play a creative role in shaping the emerging world. Thank you.
Dinabandhu, wonderful. Paul, Mary, wonderful. You have filled us with so much theological imagination. You have inspired us with so many examples, and you have motivated us to look at our own contexts and to imagine how to embody church as movement. Thank you for everyone who has been participating in the chat. One of the benefits of being online is that we can be engaging with the material even during the presentations, so that this question and answer period becomes kind of a wrap up and a moving forward in this. We're going to move into, I'm going to mention some of the topics that have been in the chat, and Dinabandhu, if you would respond, or if you would point to someone else for response on
Paul
that.
is available. Paul is available, Mary. Yep.
Thank you. And so several of the recent comments have been, is this going to be available for our future use? And yes, the recording will be available on the Eden website. And our dream is that local churches, local organizations, you and your personal ministry can continue to use these as a resource for your ministry. And so just one example of that is tomorrow evening, there will be a further discussion by the group called Church Recon out of the Center for Creative Conflict and Church Center for Creative Conflict Resolution. Got it. And so that will be one place where we can continue the conversation. So some of the things that caught our imagination were on what are some things that we can do locally in St. Louis or wherever we're located to promote these kinds of interfaith partnerships that you're speaking of. Dinabandhu, would you have any further reflection on that?
Yeah, I wish I could answer that, because I really don't know how I can comment on what can be done in St. Louis. But the point is that, you know, these initiatives are, you know, being attempted in many parts of the world. And in the past, you know, it was the interfaith dialogue sort of touched some of the doctrinal issues, or were trying to see theological convergence, you know, convergence on theological issues. But in the present context, when we are overwhelmed by supremacist ideologies, when we are overwhelmed by authoritarian regimes, when the life of the planet Earth itself is in stake, and I think the agenda of interfaith dialogue has changed. In fact, we need interfaith dialogue in action. And this is something that is being attempted in many parts of the world. And I can say in India itself and in other parts of Asia. And I'm sure I've also heard a lot of those things happening in the United States itself. So I think this is where I think we need to move away from a reflective mode more and move into an action mode to see dialogue in action and also hope in action. You know, these are the two things that we need to sort of change.
Thank you. There was quite a rich discussion on solidarity, and Dr. Coleman had, all three of you have really highlighted solidarity. I'm wondering, Paul, if you could speak to solidarity, and you were mentioning that discrimination based on work and descent has not really been recognized. How could you see solidarity in helping that recognition?
I think there are two ways in which we can express this. One, I think within our own communities, wherever we are, whether it's in St. Louis or New Delhi or anywhere in the US, or in the partners that you are working with, there are these systems and communities who are entrenched and not yet sufficiently focused on. Like, for example, I think it's only in the last maybe around 15 years, the Indian church has begun to focus on the whole aspect of caste-based discrimination within the church and also outside the church, and how church as God's mission to the wider world can also have a very, very important role in addressing that. So I think there are efforts while we are involved, or by one in identifying those and intervening and involving in those is one form of solidarity. Then there is cross solidarity. Like, for example, if there is a, whenever, like, for example, maybe you have heard of the very gruesome brutality that has been unleashed against a Dalit woman, 19-year-old Dalit teenager who has been dragged, raped, and not only raped, but brutalized, her tongue cut, back, spine broken, and then they're not given certain treatment, and the complicity of the state. Now, we need an international solidarity when such things go. I think several organizations have brought that out. We have also given a call. A solidarity to the authorities concerned. I mean, intervening to the authorities concerned, intervening to UN Human Rights Commission, the High Commissioner for Human Rights, and several other bodies. Those are the other ways of doing. Just like you had the case of George Floyd, and then there was another kind of a solidarity, global solidarity that evolved. So I think this kind of a global solidarity, which is cross-country, cross-continent, and also solidarity in ensuring within our own communities, what are the systems that exclude, and therefore, can we connect these together to see if we can have some joint campaigns, joint missions to address them anywhere in the world. I think that would be extremely helpful.
You have challenged all of us for joint campaigns and joint work, really that embody this partnership that we've been speaking of. Thank you. Unfortunately, I think we have come to the end of our time in this session. I would remind you that our second session will continue on these themes. We have laid the high-level groundwork, and our next session will be 4 panelists who are embodying these kinds of themes in their daily work and ministry in their own contexts. Would make an invitation. So on the second session, please use the same link that you used for this session, and that will connect you. And in between, in this hour, is time at 10:15 to 10:30 for Eden Seminary's regularly scheduled chapel service. And in this particular day, we will be led in worship by the Reverends Clive and Susanna Samson, who offered music at the beginning of this lecture session. And you can join in that chapel service by going to Facebook and Facebook Eden Seminary Chapel. And at 10:15, that will go live, and you can join in that. With that, we're going to sign off for now. We really appreciate everyone's participation, and we are inspired for further action. Thank you.